Well, I'm so pleased that you chose to join me on the course. And the first thing we're going to do is look at the materials that we're going to need in order to paint any pictures in watercolor. We're going to have a look at the brushes and the paints and the paper and palettes and one or two other bits and pieces as well. So let's go over to the studio and take a look.
The first thing I want to talk about is the paints, really. And people say, should I get pans like this or should I get tubes? Well, there's benefits to both, but I tend to prefer the tubes, which I'll talk about in a moment. Now, quite often if you go to an art shop, you can buy a ready-made palette. There's a little sort of field set here, which has got a number of colours in what they call pans. These are these little cubes of hard paint, which are there. Now, it's very probable that you'll have some of these at home, because that's the normal way when you're starting off to paint, that you end up buying little sets of colours like this. These are fine, and they're great to start off with. The paint in them is quite hard, so you have to scrub away quite hard with the brush to get any colour off them. And as they go down, the pan's empty, and you end up squiggling around trying to get little bits of paint out of the corners, which makes it really hard to do before you then put in a new pan that you've just bought. You don't want to waste any of the paint, and so you just try and get all the little bits out. What you really want to do when you're painting is to have lots of paint all the time that you can dig into and paint with. And that just helps with the whole process, and that's why I like to use the tubes. Now, what I suggest is, if you've got a little set like this, then once the paints have begun to run down, instead of buying a new pan, you buy a tube, and from that you squirt the paint into the empty pan just to fill it up again with fresh paint. And you can keep doing that. You can keep applying paint to it, keep it fresh, keep lots of paint in the pan. If you have bought an empty palette, then you can just start off by squeezing the paint into the empty pans there, and you've then got your colours ready to go. So I would suggest really going for tubes and using those just to keep the pans filled up with paint the whole time. One more thing to say about paints, especially with the tubes, is that you get two different qualities. You can get a student's quality, or you can get an artist's quality. And what I would do is, if you can afford it, is go for the artist's quality. They're a little bit more expensive, but the reason for saying this is that the student quality, you have to just use more paint. You have to mix more the whole time. It's a little bit harder to get the colour, the depth of colour that you might need. They're a little bit more sort of watered down, if you like, in the student's quality, which makes them a bit cheaper. And I would go for the artist quality. You'll just use less paint each time, so eventually the price is pretty much the same, but it's much easier to use the artist quality than it is the student quality. So if you can afford it when you're starting off, get the artist quality. If you can't, then start with student, and then one by one replace them with artist quality paints as you go through. Okay, let's have a look at the brushes that we'll need. Again, I've tried to keep the selection to a minimum so that you won't have a lot of expense at the beginning. Now, there's several different sorts of brushes that you can get. This one here is actually a bristle brush, and you'd use this really for acrylic painting or oil painting. Now, these are really cheap, so if you see these in the shop and are tempted to buy them, don't get them for watercolour. They're just far too bristly and hard. So we'll get rid of that one right away. We don't need that one at all. Let's have a look at the others. Brushes come in basically in two different shapes. There's rounds and there's flats. Now, this is the flat, and as you can see, it's flat. Now, that's very useful, as we'll see, for making different sorts of marks to the one that a round brush can make. So I suggest you get a flat brush. And again, if you look at the accompanying PDF, you'll see a list of the brushes and of the paints and things that I recommend that you get there. So that's a flat. This is a round, and in fact this is what they call a mop brush. It doesn't come to a very fine point, but it's very good for just laying down quick washes of colour as well. It's quite a cheap brush. I think it's made of squirrel, something like that, squirrel hair. Quite cheap and very useful. That's a number 10. I've got a number 4 here, and this is a round again, but can you see it comes to a very fine point and that's really good for working in details and getting straight edges on things and painting up to the line if you need to. So it's a smaller brush there, number 4. And the last one I've got here is what's called a rigger, and again it's a very thin brush, very long lines on there. They used to use them for painting the rigging on ships when they were painting pictures of ships in the olden days, and that's why it's called a rigger. And again, that's very useful for doing very thin lines. That's really all you need. There is one other option, and that's to get a big fella like this, and with this one brush you can do a lot of the work. It's got a big barrel here, so it holds lots of paint, which is very good for doing large washes, and it comes to a very fine point as well, and you can do some very detailed work with the point. So it's a little bit more expensive, but it might be possible that you replace some of these with just one large brush. The choice is yours. Let's have a quick look at palettes. I would recommend getting a palette which has got a lid on it, so that if you keep your paint in there, it doesn't dry out too quickly. If you can get one with a lid, that's good. This one here has got nice deep wells to put the paint into, and it's also got lovely wells here for making your mixes. When you're mixing up the paint, you can make nice puddles of paint in these compartments. So this is one that I really like. This is by Liz Deakin. I got that off the internet somewhere. Again, if you've got a smaller palette like this one, again it's got various wells and things that you can use on it to mix the paint in. A little bit shallower, but then this is a field kit for going out and painting outdoors with. Again, it's got a nice lid on it. You can also get mixing palettes that are like these, where again you've got these wells there for mixing the colour in. What you don't want to do is use like an oil painting palette, which is just a flat board, because the paint will just run off that. You do need something where you can actually get the paint to form in puddles. Again, for paper, I would say that you must use watercolour paper. Please don't use cartridge paper or printer paper or anything else that you've got lying around the house. Go out and buy some watercolour paper. The reason for this is that it has something called size on it. Sometimes the size goes right through the paper, sometimes it's just on the surface. But what this size does is to stop the paint soaking in as if it were blotting paper. It keeps the paint on the surface of the paper and makes it easy to move around and easy to lift off if you need to. So always go for watercolour paper. Now watercolour paper can come in pads like this. The sort of ring-bound pads that are very common. You can get it in blocks where it's glued around the edges, and you just have to take a knife and cut each sheet off when you've finished with it. What I tend to prefer on the whole is sheets of paper, loose sheets of paper, which are slightly cheaper. You're not paying for all the packaging, and I use these and just tape them down or fix them down onto a board. What sort of paper? Well, I would recommend going for £140 in weight and a knot surface, and that will be just great for almost everything that we do. There's all sorts of different surfaces, all sorts of different weights, but I would certainly recommend £140 and knot. Okay, what else do you need? Well, you're going to have to put your paper on something. So what I recommend you do is to get an old book, something you don't need, that you've read that you don't need anymore, and get yourself a board, a piece of hardboard or MDF or something like that, that you can rest against the book. It's important to paint on a slope. So don't have the paper on the flat, have it on a slight slope, resting on a book. You can then put your paper onto that and fix it down. What I use for fixing it down is just a little bit of masking tape, which you can fix in the corners just to hold it in place, just to stop it slipping away. The paper shouldn't wrinkle too much if you're using the £140 weight. You need some water, of course. Get a large container full of water for washing your brushes out in. Use a certain amount of kitchen roll or tissues. You're going to use that for wiping off your brushes with, for cleaning up with. Need some of that, and of course a pencil, and very probably an eraser as well. And that pretty much is all the kit that you're going to need.